Hello everyone, and welcome to Navigating Uncharted Waters Part 1. I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us. Today we are going to be talking about phishing, but first I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ally Pinheiro, and I am the Enterprise Risk, Security, and Compliance Professional for Critical Ops. I am a risk researcher and cybersecurity compliance officer. I manage our own cybersecurity efforts, and I conduct cybersecurity assessments for other companies that may be looking to be compliant with NIST and CMMC, or they may just be looking to strengthen their overall security posture. I decided to start this webinar series with phishing because while it's a basic concept, it's a very serious attack method. 90% of all cyber attacks begin with a phishing email. It's the very first method that leads to malware. Why? Because it's easy. A person interested in hacking into your network doesn't actually need to be a programmer or have any experience. They just need your credentials. It's far easier today with multi-factor authentication and better password practices to manipulate us into handing all that information over compared to trying to guess our passwords. According to Cisco, about 150 million phishing emails are sent each day, and many of these scams take advantage of current events. In March of last year, email phishing alone related to COVID increased by 667%. While we knew about COVID before March, it seems like these hit when lockdowns around the world started. Compared to before the pandemic, users are now 3 times more likely to click on a phishing link and enter their credentials. Due to all of this, COVID can now be classified as the largest ever cybersecurity threat. And unfortunately, cybersecurity budgets are still expected to decrease this year. Today, we are going to be talking about all forms of phishing, but let's start off with email. Phishing through email targets anybody in the organization. It typically has some sense of urgency to force the receiver to act immediately. Unfortunately, only 3% of users report phishing emails when they receive them. I'm pretty confident that all of you have received a phishing email at some point, whether you recognize it or not. There are a lot of tips on how to recognize phishing emails, and I will go into those a little bit later, but for right now, let's talk about what you can do to prevent them from landing in your mailbox. If you work for an organization, you can use anti-malware security that has automatic email filtering capabilities. If you already use anti-malware, make sure you update the software when new patches come out. Use multi-factor authentication whenever and wherever you can to prevent people from being able to use your credentials if they do steal them. And also, be careful of what you share on social media. Obviously, you aren't posting your passwords on Facebook, but you may have enough information online for people to make some guesses on what your password could be, such as the name of your kids or what school you went to. And most importantly, educate yourself and your employees. There are a lot of tools online, like phishing awareness quizzes, to test your knowledge. Spear phishing attacks target a specific person, such as a system administrator, a developer, executives, or really any person that has access to sensitive information. So instead of just throwing out a bunch of emails and hoping some of them stick, the attacker is spending some extra time to steal specific login credentials. Attacks like these typically target intellectual property or confidential information. 95% of all attacks on enterprise networks are a result of spear phishing. 83% of these spear phishing attacks are brand impersonation. A very common one that we see often is an email appearing like it is coming from Microsoft. We'll look at one of these later. A single spear phishing attack costs an average of $1.6 million. Next, we have whaling. Whaling is similar to spear phishing, but it is even more specific. Whaling targets the C-suite in an organization, like the CEO or CFO. Attackers use whaling to steal the C-suite credentials and then impersonate senior management to gain access to sensitive data or money. When they impersonate somebody like the CEO, they will use their email address so that any communication they do with other members of the organization appear to be completely legitimate. They will use corporate logos and maybe set up a fraudulent website that appears to look legitimate. An example of a whaling attack is sending a phishing attack posing as Microsoft to a CEO's assistant to steal the assistant's credentials. The attacker would then be able to log into the assistant's email and request payroll information or even income tax documents using the assistant's email. All the while, this looks completely legitimate. Vishing targets people by phone through social engineering tactics, and it's considered criminal phone fraud. In 2018, Vishing cost victims $48 million according to the FBI. Something that is very common is using technical jargon to confuse people on the phone. For example, they might pretend to be tech support and tell you that the authentication method on your account needs to now be verified through a secondary method, and it's very complicated to set up. So the IT team will do it for them, but they need to share their password. Common themes we see outside the office are people pretending to be the bank or the IRS. They may even offer an extended warranty on your car. There are a few things we can do to prevent phishing, but I don't think this problem will really go away. First, you can join the National Do Not Call Registry, which is donotcall.gov. Here, you can report calls and register your phone number. Other organizations like charities will still call you, but you will not receive telemarketing calls. You can also avoid the call altogether, hang up, or verify the caller's identity. Be aware that the IRS and Social Security don't call people, they send letters. Your Social Security number should never be canceled. If you think something might be legitimate, hang up and call the organization directly to see if the call was legitimate. And last but not least, we have farming. Farming is a bit different from the others and takes a lot more skill to carry out, but I'll try to keep my explanation non-technical. Essentially, when your computer wants to visit a website, it reaches out to this big server called the Domain Name System, or DNS. An attacker can use what's called cache poisoning to change the website address in the domain name system. By doing this, they can have your computer automatically connect to a malicious website that looks like the website you are trying to visit. So you would type in the correct web address, but the server that your computer reaches out to is telling your computer to go somewhere else. This is not really something you can prevent against if you are just a regular user. DNS servers refresh themselves often. Just keep this possibility in the back of your mind like you do with phishing emails. If a website looks a bit off, check the URL to see if you are redirected. And last but not least, we have farming. Farming is a bit different from the others and takes a lot more skill to carry out, but I'll try to keep my explanation non-technical. Essentially, when your computer wants to visit a website, it reaches out to this big server called the Domain Name System, or DNS. An attacker can use what's called cache poisoning to change the website address in the domain name system. By doing this, they can have your computer automatically connect to a malicious website that looks like the website you are trying to visit. So you would type in the correct web address, but the server that your computer reaches out to is telling your computer to go somewhere else. This is not really something you can prevent against if you are just a regular user. DNS servers refresh themselves often. Just keep this possibility in the back of your mind like you do with phishing emails. If a website looks a bit off, check the URL to see if you are redirected. There are 4 questions to keep in mind with phishing emails. Asking yourself these 4 questions could lead you to recognizing an email as malicious. First, look at who sent it. Does the email address look off in any way? Are they asking for something out of the ordinary? If so, call them. Don't reply to their email because it could be an attacker. Next, is it asking you to click on a link? A link should be an automatic red flag. A good practice is to actually right-click on the link and copy the link address. I usually copy the link address and paste it into a Word document to see if it's legitimate. Is the email vague or generic? Most of the time, organizations will use your name in the email. If it's a generic greeting such as "Hi dear," it could be suspicious. Also, is it too good to be true? Is a prince offering you tens of millions of dollars? It's probably not real. Now I'd like to look at some phishing emails with you and see if we can spot the red flags. This first one is coming from a bank. Go ahead and pause this video and take a look at the phishing email. This email looks pretty legitimate. It has the bank logo and even the bar at the bottom with links to the privacy policy and terms of service. One thing that stuck out to me is the email address. This might be hard to see, but the email is not coming from SunTrust, but coming from SunTust. It's missing the letter R. Next, the opening of the email is a bit generic. A lot of banks will have your name in the opening, but instead it says, "Dear SunTrust Client." It's much more time consuming for an attacker to load the recipient's name so they can turn to generic greetings like this. Also, the language in the first few sentences has very poor grammar. The SunTrust name is all lowercase. The second sentence says, "We recently contacted you after noticing on your online account which has been accessed unusually." This next phishing email contains a link, and I wanted to show you that you should always hover over the link or do that copy and paste method I mentioned earlier. It's really easy to hide a suspicious link in the button, as shown here. This next email is coming from a university email account. Go ahead and pause the video and take a look. This one is a bit more sophisticated from the last. The first thing I noticed is that the content of the message is urgent, but also doesn't really say anything. Many universities do include the situation details in emails like this. Also, the email address doesn't appear to be coming from the college itself. I also noticed that the signature says it's coming from Richard Nixon. Not only is that very strange, but it also doesn't match up with the email owner's name, Elizabeth. This next email is coming from PayPal. Is there anything suspicious about this one? You can pause the video now. Like I mentioned earlier, a generic opening is a very big red flag. The language in the email is also a bit off. The punctuation and capitalization doesn't make sense, and there are clearly some words missing. Take a look at this one and see if there's anything suspicious that jumps out at you. First, the email is coming from a .NET account, which is actually pretty clever. The greeting is generic as well, and the English is a bit off. This is a good one though, and I want to show you where the link leads. When you click on that link at the bottom, it leads you to an Office 365 login page that looks very legitimate, but the web address is wrong. This web address is redacted, but it leads to a website created by the attacker. When you submit your username and password, you are offering up that information to the attackers. This is why it's important to look at that link before clicking on it. If you receive one of these emails, there are a few things you can do. First, if you know the person or organization emailing you, call them to verify that they sent it. Mark the email as spam, and if you work for an organization, send it to your IT team. Sometimes marking it as spam does automatically send it to them, but it is a good practice to share it with them in case others in your organization have received it. You can also report the attack to the FTC at ftc.gov/complaint. There are some things you can do to protect yourself as well. Use a security software like anti-malware. That way, if you do accidentally download some malware from a phishing email, your anti-malware can catch it. Also, set up automatic updates. Don't ignore updates to your computer or your anti-malware software. You can schedule it for later, but it's really important to keep these updated. Updating your computer will close newly discovered vulnerabilities that attackers can take advantage of. Anti-malware updates add newly discovered virus signatures, which is essentially their indicator that your computer has been infected with some malware. Also, use multi-factor authentication whenever possible. Yes, it can be a bit troublesome, but it will be your saving grace if your credentials do get stolen. Back up your data regularly so that if an attack does happen, you can recover and reduce your losses. We'll talk about this more in our third series of Navigating Uncharted Waters. Educate your employees with training on recognizing phishing emails. There are some free websites you can use to take quizzes. You can also invest in automated solutions to analyze emails before they hit employee mailboxes. There are also organizations that can help with red teaming exercises that will safely attempt to steal credentials by sending phishing emails to your employees. Also, be careful what you share on social media. Make sure that your passwords don't use your kids' names or important dates. Passwords can be guessed very easily, so use complex passwords and multi-factor authentication to restrict unwanted access. That's all I have for today on phishing. I'd like to announce that Critical Ops is now offering free cybersecurity consultations. We can help you strengthen your password policies, we can help you red team for phishing credentials, and we can strengthen your cybersecurity posture with a few different services. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions you have at my email on the screen. In our next webinar video, we'll be talking about supply chain risk, which is a huge threat right now. I will be talking about how you can evaluate the supply chain, how to select who you connect your islands with, how to vet security connections, and how to prioritize cybersecurity at all phases of your programs and projects. I hope to see you there.